in the center. Oh, thank you. In the center of Alaska in Lower Tama-Dene area, I am Inupiat, so more to left. I like to show the language map just to really show the diversity in Alaska of Indigenous peoples. And that's something I really consider a lot in the sense of how I am representing Indigenous people in academia and what I'm doing in my work, really honoring kind of the lessons I've learned, especially from Dene teachers. I think there's so many fabulous ones. Again, a lot of the ones that have been highlighted so far in the Shine Light series. I'm just learning a lot from them. So a bit about myself. I am Inupiat. My family originally comes from King Island, the Mayak family. There's a photo of my grandmother, Teresa Mayak. My Inupiat name is Anamaq. I am an interstate PhD candidate at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I study co-production of knowledge. Specifically, I look at boundary spanners and evaluation, and I have a background in permafrost and engineering. I currently work at the International Arctic Research Center, or IARC, and specifically kind of the two programs I work within is Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, or ACAP, which is a NOAA CAP or RESA if that's relevant to you. I'm also 1/3 time working on RNA co-ops, which is a pilot project for Saigon Roads, which is basically Arctic observing. There's a lot to that I'm not going to dive into, but if that's relevant to you, that's great. You can kind of connect me through that. So something that I've done in the past in talking about kind of my positionality and my approach to my work is really kind of understanding what does it mean to be an Indigenous scientist myself. I think there's a lot of tokenization for myself that I feel like I'm kind of put in a box. I'm either Indigenous or a scientist, but not both at the same time. And so I developed this for a project kind of looking at that and how I approach doing research in general and just life. And I think there's a really strong center in values. Some are Inupiat values, some are just values I've learned from my family. And so respect, self-determination, collaboration, really striving to make the world better, humility, empathy, and learning. And then there's a side of me that is very Indigenous, which is really the why, kind of the reasons why I would choose certain projects over not. My family, really uplifting Indigenous voices, really caring for each other, and kind of like the hands and the heart, something my advisor talks about, versus like in the scientist side is more my head. And so from the scientist side, my father is actually a political philosopher, so I do actually like debating quite a bit. I like nerding out, intellectualizing, problem solving, and writing. And I don't really see them. I think there's a concept of code switching that doesn't quite accurately represent these. These are like two aspects of myself, but it is still myself. I don't feel like I'm two different people. It is just like different expressions depending on where I am and what I'm doing, but it's all, again, very centered around values. And so diving into kind of these three parts of my talk, one is describing what is co-production of knowledge and what is the theory behind it. And so in defining co-production of knowledge, a lot of the literature is centered around the science policy interface, in the sense that you're co-developing every step of the research process with the intended users. And so functionally, the users are treated as co-researchers, decision-making partners in the process. And the reason for doing co-production knowledge is in the sense if you're trying to get your science used by policymakers, because this process creates a sense of belonging, leadership, and shared ownership over the outcomes, therefore it gets used. That's kind of the fundamental theory behind co-production knowledge. And looking at what is co-production knowledge and what isn't compared to other community engagement approaches, such as community-based participatory action research, there are 4 principles of co-production knowledge. This is pluralistic, meaning 2 or more knowledge systems. Context-based and goal-oriented, I feel like they're really tied to each other, because again, if you're making this relevant to community partners, to the intended users, you really need to be in the context and goal-oriented, versus a lot of general research is more towards abstraction, generalization of ideas. It's kind of needing to balance that. It also needs to be interactive, that co-producing every step of the research process. I also included here this large text, which I'm not going to read, NSF's definition of co-production knowledge, which does align fairly well to this broader definition of co-production knowledge, with the different knowledge systems needing to have shared research questions, pursue shared methodologies, and agree upon appropriate outreach and data sharing activities, and fully engage people in the complete research cycle. But there is a fundamental difference in doing co-production knowledge with policymakers versus with marginalized communities, such as applying co-production knowledge when working with Indigenous or Alaska Native communities, because you really need to consider the historical and present-day context of inequality, racism, and colonization that they exist in, and they really need to be addressed within the project with power dynamics and things like that, as well as the intended impacts of that project. So again, like, there could be certain goals with the project, but in some sense, a lot of it is towards achieving Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination when working with Indigenous communities. There's also the sense too of like, what are you co-producing with? Because if there's science policy, it's kind of the broader norm. So you'd think when you're working with Indigenous communities, it'd be science community, which is one of the functions. I really think that's within the concept of broadening participation within science, which is fairly important. But I think when you're talking about achieving societal benefits for Indigenous communities, you're really looking at kind of a three-way circle, which is science, policy, and community, where, and this is kind of from research that's a bit pending that I'm working on with some people, in the sense that a lot of Indigenous communities see the strong linkages between science and policy, and they're looking to enter into that connection. And you see some examples of that in different formats. I think IARPIC is an example, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee is an example of that. There's also a lot of other relevant things as well. And I think really the intent for long-term systemic change is to develop genuine partnerships, that there aren't these separate boundaries, they're all merging together, because then you don't have these inequalities as much. I was just checking the chat. Okay. And I think there has been a shift in the literature, in the broader literature on co-production knowledge. I think in general, co-production knowledge doesn't quite have a solid definition yet. There's a lot of newer work on categorizing the past projects and how different people approach co-production knowledge. And so the first column, Bremer and Misch, they categorize really based on the activities that a project does. You can kind of see some influence of disciplines within it, versus a few of these years later, there's Chambers et al. 2021, and they really talk about in the sense of power and purpose and the motivation behind. And I think between these just 4-year difference, there's been a lot of publications on the power and politics in doing research with marginalized communities. So these are Indigenous people, as well as Black communities and those different kinds of communities. Working internationally as well is a topic as well. And so it's kind of just showing you that there has been a lot of shifts within the broader kind of literature of co-production knowledge. And then also I wanted to highlight one of the foundational things when you're talking about Arctic research is this Yamyo co-production of knowledge conceptual model, which I did see before I jumped off that Julie Raymond Yacobian is listening in, and she's one of the co-authors. And I think this is really important to working with Alaska Natives because it shifts the model. So a lot of the broader literature we're talking about science policy interface is really around science use, the utilization, versus, and that's kind of like the driving function behind everything you do within the project is to get the users to use the science. Versus here, when you look at the model, the cornerstone is equity. And that really then speaks to really needing to change how you're doing co-production knowledge when you're working with Indigenous communities. And then you kind of see the very center really aligns well with co-production of knowledge. And then the outer ring really highlights Indigenous ethics that are really important. And you really need to do these things in order to even achieve co-production knowledge. And that's something that I find really interesting looking at co-production knowledge in general, is the flexibility of co-production knowledge and how you achieve it varies greatly. You can approach it from Indigenous methodologies, from more Western methodologies. And I think there's just a lot to think about within what you need to do in order to meet the needs of who you're working with to achieve it. And even myself, I've used in doing co-production knowledge, I've done different approaches that are more around convergence research and how you kind of help people kind of get a shared understanding. I've also hosted workshops that served as research and facilitating dialogue to come to a shared understanding and converge around ideas, and then produce concepts out of that research. And I like to kind of center where is co-production knowledge in the broader scheme of things, because quite often co-production knowledge, if you kind of know about it, is kind of shown at like the very end of a spectrum. It's like highest to achieve, and it is something that is hard to achieve. Co-producing every step of the research process is pretty difficult. But when you look at the broad scheme of things, so if you center this around, say you want your outcome to be Indigenous resilience. If you do typical research, so this is scientists researching solutions, the normal routine, the single loop, you do get iterative improvements on aspects that achieve Indigenous resilience. And those sometimes are important. I'm not saying they're not, but they do have a place that has function. Versus if you start then reframing it, that's where co-production knowledge, and then you start asking questions like, are we solving the right problem? Maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing. Maybe this one's better. And that's kind of where co-production of knowledge lives. Versus when you start looking at the context and questioning it, then that's where Indigenous self-determination comes in. And you really start questioning, what is the ultimate purpose of my project? If it is Indigenous resilience, to get Indigenous resilience comes through Indigenous self-determination. And then that kind of then decenters researchers from the process and really start thinking about then how research can support Indigenous self-determination. And then there's these concepts in kind of how I look at it is kind of research as colonial acts. You really start getting into different literature. And there's a lot of literature on kind of critical methodologies. And that's kind of where I want to highlight. These are the ones I cite often, also like key and like some of the oldest, kind of show that there's a huge field around this. And so there's Vine Deloria, Custer died for your sins, 1969, Linda Tuai Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies, 1999. Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, which is Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's a Black psychology researcher. And that one is not Indigenous focused, but she has a lot of really great concepts in there on research and how it's been problematic in the past, more Alaska relevant, 2003, Hunters and Bureaucrats. And then these two papers are a bit newer, but I cite them quite often. So I want to highlight them, which is Decolonization, Not a Metaphor, Eve Tuck and Yang, 2012. And then Making Invisible Visible, The Acts of Commission Omission, Stephanie Freiberg and Easton. And there's a bit functionality difference between critical methodologies and Indigenous methodologies. I like to separate them a bit in the sense that critical methodologies is unlearning. So these is where you kind of understand how research has been a colonial act and could be still, versus Indigenous methodology is more learning and thinking about how you make projects more culturally responsive. And again, just there is a whole field around Indigenous methodologies, but these are some of the key ones that I cite a lot. So 2008, Research as Ceremony, Sean Wilson, 2009, Indigenous methodologies, Margaret Kovach. Two-white seeing is a concept I really like, which is originally by Albert Marshall. So that's the paper link describing it. For a lot, like the Arctic, SciQ is really great. This one's from 2020. So this is Inuit And then there is, the framework I showed earlier on co-production of knowledge, the circle. And so when you start thinking about like, well, what is research as colonial acts? When you look at the history of research, so since the scientific revolution, when they're developing current methodologies that are still used today, during that time, there's also the end of monarch rule. And so there was development of individualism, rational rules of laws at the same time, as well as was imperialism. And so really there is people looking for justification to do colonialism, to do slavery, really the roots of racism and sexism and those elements. And that again leads to supremacy. And so this is really the science behind creating other in a devalued position. And you still see some of those elements today that scientific knowledge is considered superior to other knowledge systems, which is problematic. And where research comes in is really being able to define that power and have that power to define things. And so it's really this intertwined colonial ideology that is really still present in research today. And then start kind of going into these concepts of what do they look like. One of them is co-opting Indigenous methodologies and knowledges. And so there's this quote from Linda Toy Smith in her book, colonialism is not just about the collection, it's also about the rearrangement, representation, and redistribution. And so again, it's outsiders defining what is Indigenous knowledge, what is Indigenous concepts, worldview, and those elements. A lot of roots within anthropology was that was problematic in the past. And I still think that exists today, because even if there's a sense that like when Indigenous people are speaking, that they're speaking and what they're contributing is anecdotal knowledge, and that needs to get validated by science, when it really should be like, well, we shouldn't really be validating Indigenous knowledge with science. As well as there are sometimes misrepresentation by accident, because there are some Indigenous concepts, even translating them from Indigenous language into English changes the meaning. And that, is accidental, but there's just a lot of caution to be aware of when working with Indigenous communities and making sure you're not misrepresenting them. And this is kind of where I start thinking about more Indigenous methodologies instead of knowledges, which is really learning from Indigenous methodologies. I think is really important, but being careful not to co-opt them and change them. So that's something I think about a lot. So Indigenous methodologies, by definition, some people might not know, is completely within the tribal or ancestral knowledge system and ways of doing research. So this is observing, oral traditions, sharing, all these elements which are equivalent to research in Indigenous. And these are, again, very specific to your community. And so if I were to do Indigenous methodologies, it would actually be with the King Island community. I don't claim to do Indigenous methodologies. I definitely learn from it. I'm also really cautious in how I talk about Indigenous methodologies because I want to give it credit. But at the same time, when I talk about it, I don't want people to misunderstand and think I am, and that changes the meaning, because I think Indigenous methodologies are really important. And it's not something I do. I do co-production knowledge. I do a lot of more pulling in science and blending the knowledge systems. Another concept is othering. And you see this a lot in the creation of frameworks, systems, comparison. All these are forms of othering. It is this oversimplification to discuss differences. Ultimately, it is tokenization. I say this because also, like you'll see later, I've also done this though, because it is, how you talk about it. So I think it's useful to discuss, but it should be used with caution and really shown with a disclaimer that it's not necessarily 100% accurate, because there's a lot of complexity in it. And I think with othering in the broader context of research, there is this concept I really like called weird researchers, which are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And so, vast majority of academia are weird researchers, which becomes problematic in the peer review process. There's a normalization of weird experiences and perspectives as the baseline and then everything else gets compared to. And there's just this unconscious, inappropriate applying of weird experiences onto other worldviews. And that's kind of where it's just like, you really need to be culturally aware when doing working with Indigenous people. That's kind of the last point, and the sense of when you're doing co-production knowledge, really having a concept of these predefined roles within projects and programs for Indigenous people is othering. And it stems from the lack of cultural awareness of project and program land use, as well as lack of representation. The next concept is at-risk peoples. This is from Chuck and Yang, this asterisk, but also at-risk peoples, kind of this intertwined concept, where Indigenous people are quite often asterisk people. They have low population, they're at the margins, therefore they're sometimes not even included in research projects such as health research or in general. And then there's also the concept of at-risk people, which is representing Indigenous people as victims, or that creates a process of victimization of those Indigenous people. And so an example of that is in the past, the collection of traditional ecological knowledge before it's lost. That was kind of like a driving function of a lot of research with Indigenous people in the past. Versus another way to look at it is respecting Indigenous sovereignty over lands and waters, instead of kind of having, again, you're validating Indigenous knowledge with science by collecting TEK before it's lost. Another way I like to frame it is through the omission and commission framework. Omission is looking at what doesn't exist and what is left out, and really kind of like looking at programs and projects. Is there omission of Indigenous people? And then the commission, and that is looking at what does exist and does that uphold biases in inaccurate representation. And really kind of how you avoid either is really allowing Indigenous people to tell their own stories their own way. Really, that Indigenous representation is crucial. Another concept is UNDRIP and FPIC. UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. And associated with that, which is what I'm focusing on because more research related, is FPIC, which is free, prior, informed consent, which is a standard ethics concept that if you go through ethics training, it's in there. But where FPIC, UNDRIP and FPIC kind of do it a little bit differently, which I really respect and highlight difference, is free is really self-directed by the community without expectations or timelines. And prior is before in activities, including the authorization to start planning or doing any of those elements. And so really it's contacting people very early on in the planning process. And consent is not just one and done, it's an ongoing process. And then there's a concept I really like from Decolonizing is Not a Metaphor, which is decolonization is appropriation of Indigenous land and life. And that's it. And so even research, decolonizing research, decolonization research, it's a term I don't use that often, even though I think the concept of colonial acts, research as colonial acts is really important. I don't use decolonization or decolonizing because it's still somewhat of a distraction from the reparation of Indigenous land and life. And within this paper, there is this concept, which is settlers' moves to innocence, which are strategies to avoid guilt and responsibility for decolonization. And so I have them listed here because I think they're really relevant in analyzing projects, which is claiming naivety, deflecting settler identity, claiming space for Indigenous people, just because you work with them, equality over equity, focusing on mind and intentions over actual reparations, actual actions, instead of you're just focusing on like those more internal aspects. And that kind of with that framework from this amazing literature and field is looking at co-production knowledge in action. Co-production knowledge inherently is very aspirational, but also very difficult to achieve because it takes, in order to do co-production knowledge, I think there has to be a lot of systemic change, more organizational support, more funding around it. All these elements really need to change for people to even do co-production of knowledge. And where it's really relevant in the Arctic is NSF's Navigating the New Arctic, so NSF, National Science Foundation, NNA for short. What they have in their program is advocating for co-production knowledge with Arctic Indigenous communities, and this is from their call for proposals, outcomes that enables resilient and sustainable Arctic communities. And then they've also received criticism from Indigenous leaders in Western Alaska, listed here, ABCP, Quirk, Bering Sea Elders Group, Allied community of St. Paul. They wrote 2 letters, which are in that link below. I really encourage people to read them because, again, I'm not trying to represent what they have in there. I'm trying to like place it in context of this broader literature and give context. Some key points that are relevant to this discussion is kind of the lack of understanding what co-production knowledge is, both with researchers, individual researchers doing projects as well as the program, ensuring competency and expertise of researchers. So researchers that are funded, do they have competency and expertise to do co-production knowledge? Asking NSF to move away from Western approaches and more towards Indigenous methodologies and co-production of knowledge, building capacity with Indigenous communities to do research, and really having Indigenous representation in the peer review process and within the program itself. And to kind of, again, provide context in how we're kind of thinking and moving it all together. So co-production knowledge is really about a process, not the outcomes. You can evaluate whether a project is co-produced or not by the 4 principles: pluralistic, context-based, goal-oriented, and interactive. But really, to achieve co-production knowledge is through the process, because the process provides legitimacy and relevancy. And so this is kind of the typical process being driven by funding cycles. You can have more evaluation discussions on research that are more holistic and Indigenous representative. But since we're talking about NSF and NA, this is kind of very linear, and it's also just generally a lot of research still functions this way. You have, every project exists within the context. And so organizational support, funding structures, what are they asking for in funding? As well, again, like the context of colonialism within Alaska. And then when you start going through the process of these inputs, there starts with inputs, which is interpersonal, which is in yourself. And so, you know, the element I started with the positionality is kind of my self-reflection of like who I am, as well as like my education. Am I ready to do research? Do I understand how to do it? Those different aspects. Interpersonal is the interactions between people, team dynamics, power dynamics are really important. And then there's partnerships. And this is where you kind of switch into developing a formal partnerships with community partners to do a project together. And then that then shifts into the process. You submit a proposal and you shift into the process of actually doing it. And so practice is like best practices if you're a researcher. So this is like ethics, engagement strategies, those different types of things are within practice. And then there's actually implementation of the project. And so this is, you know, co-producing the steps. And so doing the data collection together, co-analysis, co-dissemination, those different elements. And then that leads to outputs. These are like physical, tangible things coming up out of the project. And so presentations, reports, peer-reviewed journal articles, those types of things. And then that's kind of the process. And then that shifts into the outcomes. And so outcomes are your short-term measurable things that you come out of projects, so such as like you had goals going into the project. Did you achieve those or not? As well as there anything that kind of directly short-term that you can point to, the project did this and it created this outcome. Impacts are long-term, they're harder to measure. I think it's really important this to co-define societal benefit impacts with community members, and then you could revisit doing it, revisit like did you actually achieve those at a later date. And I think in general, there's a lot of, when you're talking about co-production knowledge and whether you did a successful project or not, there's a lot of perspectives on it. I think the perspective of the researcher is going to be a lot different than the community partner. And this kind of then goes into thinking about researchers and how they would approach doing research, co-production knowledge. And this is where I feel like I've tokenized, I created these kind of token boxes. There's a concept within research design called research paradigms. And so I created dispositions based off those research paradigms. I call them dispositions because I don't think anyone really fits solely in one box, but it is a way to talk about differences and to talk about how different researchers, different perspectives on how to do research. And so starting with the left, post-positivist is vast majority of natural scientists are trained in post-positive methodologies. They're also generally not aware that they're trained into it. And so they do hypothesis testing, they prioritize the scientific outputs and anything that leads to those scientific outputs. And then kind of closely related is constructivists. And a lot of natural social scientists are trained under constructivists. And so they're looking at perspectives and capturing those. So that means they're a bit more focused on the interpersonal dynamics at the beginning of the project, but also throughout the project and how it carries out. Both these in the red are academic centered. So like they usually work in universities. And then because the way universities reward people for doing good jobs is they do peer-reviewed publications. And so that then sets up who validates whether a project is successful or not are other researchers. In the middle, the gray pragmatic is a bit of a flexible box. These are people who do like applied research, engineers, a lot of geologists. These are do like very practical things. That is research, but for very practical outcomes. They're looking at usability. They're looking at developing outputs and outcomes. So these could be actual products, tools, reports. They're looking at the user and scientists for validation of whether a project is successful. And since they also could work in academia, they're looking at developing the product, but also potentially publications. And then the one that I've boxed out, the transformative, the next one, the pink are both community centered. Transformative research are looking to achieve social justice. That's kind of their driving purpose to do research. They're looking at the impacts, creating positive changes in the community, really what benefits the community. And then the last one generally actually isn't included. Indigenous is not included in the general discussions of research paradigms, but I included it because talking about working with Indigenous people and it's a valid methodology. And so Indigenous methodology, when you look, I talked about it's really centered in the culture, but I think what's across all of them is the concept of why they're doing it is self-determination. It is acknowledging that they are, that Indigenous people have been doing research in their own way for a long time, and they're doing that. So it's very self-determination. They focus a lot on the intrapersonal, so inside yourself. The positionality is really important. That's also the reason why Indigenous people generally want to know you as a person if you're trying to work with them, because that's something that's really important to them. Both the pinks, they're very community centered. That's who validates their outcomes. And again, success for Indigenous people is self-determination, whether they're able to really have a project that really defines the community in their own way. And I highlighted the transformative in a box because when you're looking at kind of the criticism of people not doing co-production knowledge the right way in NNA projects, really probably the only research paradigm right out the bat capable of doing co-production knowledge work is transformative. They have the kind of training expertise to do it. And that's kind of what they invested in. They have community contacts and networks. They also generally have interdisciplinary experience working with scientists. They know how research projects work. And so really these are it. And so I think the other ones have capability, but there is some additional training and awareness. You see more partnerships needed between those. But this is something to consider, is just kind of dumping co-production knowledge as a concept onto people without teaching them what it is. Really, it's only a very small group of researchers that could actually do it right away. Another concept from co-production knowledge and associate like the science policy boundary, is the question like, how does you get knowledge used? So this is a science use aspect, and they have these three factors, which is relevance, credibility, and legitimacy. Or relevance, that's kind of where context base is really important. Relevance to the community. Credibility is really the uncertainty, both scientific uncertainty, but also like uncertainty in not knowing what the topic is or the subject. And legitimacy is a sense of fairness. And I bring this up because I think there are distinct tensions in relevance, credibility, and legitimacy. And I just highlighted two here. One is post-positivist and then Indigenous. So for relevance, why would scientists do research projects, co-production knowledge? It's really being driven by funding and what's considered innovative. So co-production knowledge is really set up to be innovative in NNA. Therefore, they're trying to do it. They're also really interested in applying their own expertise. And so usually they're very disciplined. A CI scientist wants to do a project related to CI generally, and then they're not going to do something else that maybe might be more important to a community. Versus when you're looking at Indigenous people and why they want to participate, it'd be community priorities. And then when you're looking at credibility, scientists will look at it as, what kind of scientific methods are they using? They also look, peer review process is really important to developing credibility. So these other scientists looking at it and being like, from our expertise, we agree or not. And then for Indigenous people, they also have their own peer review process with Indigenous knowledges. And then one element, if someone was looking at a project working with Indigenous people, one element they look at is whether something's Indigenous led or not, because again, that representation, are they accurately representing Indigenous people? So they look who's leading the team. And then the last one, legitimacy, a lot of that has to do with power dynamics, team dynamics. For post-positivists, they're going to actually look at a project too for legitimacy. Is it an independent project, therefore non-biased? Versus for Indigenous people, it's a bit opposite. For Indigenous methodologies, instead of being independent is objective, to them, it's being deeply subjective. And so that's where the concept of positionality, like really doing a lot of self-reflection of your relationship, your biases, and those elements, and that's how you achieve objectivity. And so it's very different. For legitimacy for Indigenous people, you'd be really looking at shared decision-making is legitimacy to them, as well as equitable distribution of funding. That's what's fair to them. Are they able to actually represent themselves within a project? Do they have the resources and those elements? And then kind of like taking a long way, again, back a bit through the theory of co-production knowledge, and then looking again at more of the colonial acts in NNA and NNA projects. And so there's a concept of settlers' moves to innocence from Tuck and Yang. And one of them, I think, is claiming naivety. And so there is, misusing the term co-production knowledge when the project's not actually doing co-production knowledge. And so I think what's really common was highlighted in the letters to NSF is scientists claiming to do co-production knowledge, but then they have a fully written proposal and budget and everything, and then they approach the community, which is not co-production knowledge. Co-production knowledge, like you need to be co-developing that with the community, the proposal and the research design, all those different elements with the community to co-production of knowledge. Vast majority of projects generally don't do that because they don't know. And so therefore they have no chances of really being co-production knowledge if they didn't co-produce that proposal with communities. And I think what's kind of frustrating, like the claiming naivety aspect of this, is the sense, a lot of discussions I've heard about, well, there's no set definition on co-production knowledge, and these kind of discussions like, well, what is co-production knowledge? But co-production knowledge, as well as Indigenous engagement, are whole disciplines. And in some sense, I don't think it's really fair to claim naivety anymore. And it really should be the peer review process meeting those standards within that literature, I think is really important. Also within settlers' move to innocence is not taking responsibility. And so again, this is a point brought up in letters, is projects misusing or not using co-production knowledge within NNA, but still getting funded anyways. And when you're kind of someone looking at it from outside, from the Indigenous perspective, it really doesn't seem fair versus like if NNA claims to wanting to create resilient communities. There's also a sense of token roles within a lot of projects. Just again, really, when you have token roles, you lack self-determination. And so this is within projects of Indigenous people, which is really important, as well as NNA really set up where there is no free prior informed consent, meaning NNA has timelines It didn't start outreach with communities. It started outreach with researchers, and they put in proposals. And so this all becomes very rushed from the perspective of a community being asked to partner in sense of like, well, the deadline is in a couple weeks. You either sign up or we're not applying, or we're going to go work with a different community. Like there's just a lot of pressure on a community instead of it just being open, being free. So I see some messages. Okay, I think those can be answered later. Some aspects to looking at the NNA call for proposals. The justification for NNA starts with this language of the risk of an ice-free Arctic by mid-century and continues with this statement, which I highlighted. The rapid wide-scale changes occurring in response to this warming portend new opportunities, unprecedented risks to natural systems and social and cultural systems and economics, political and legal systems, and built environments for the Arctic and across the globe. And I think I bolded these two parts when you're kind of looking at it from this critical lens. New opportunities, unprecedented risks are really strong justification. Unprecedented risks, again, really kind of highlights at-risk people for Indigenous people, which is a bit problematic. And then on the flip side, the new priority opportunities really has a colonial feel to it, as well as just the name navigating the Arctic. Because, whalers, gold miners, fur traders in the past also saw the Arctic as new and also saw the new opportunities and really exploited it. And I think it kind of really sets up then the mindset that researchers are basically doing the same thing, getting funding and exploiting Indigenous people. And that's kind of where there's been debate on like, is it offensive and why? Like, especially the name. And I think that's something to consider. I think when you look at it from the science perspective, it is new Arctic in the sense that it's like there's a lot happening with climate change, and then therefore is a lot of science potential. But I think, there are people that live here, and I think that should be considered. And then the other bold part, the Arctic and across the globe, again, that sets up like the importance of people outside the Arctic looking at the Arctic and benefiting from doing that research. And then that kind of then sets up with the statement from the second letter to NSF, tens of billions of dollars of federal funding have been invested in research that does not achieve societal benefits for Arctic peoples who are currently experiencing disproportionate and extreme impacts of climate change. And when you look at NNA, kind of my big question I have in doing like a critical analysis of NNA is, what is the purpose of NNA? Is NNA to fund research as usual that has some elements where it's a bit more towards doing societal benefits? It's a bit more applied, but it's basically still research as usual. Or is NNA's purpose to create societal benefits for Arctic Indigenous communities? And I think when you have those two different mindsets and it's kind of vague in the wording, no one's really explicitly saying what it is, you have a lot of confusion and tension within that. And so I think that's something that's, if there is a potential for NNA 2.0 going forward, because NNA is ending, this last funding cycle would have been the 5 years that they committed to. And I haven't heard, maybe other people have, if there is a new kind of program replacing NNA, or if NNA is continuing, I'm not sure. And I think another thing for me personally, studying co-production knowledge in general, is the definition of co-production knowledge and what goes forward. I think we're kind of at a paradigm shift, which you really see within the literature of co-production knowledge, as well as with NNA, and like what scientists are talking about with NNA, is the definition people are going to be using the science policy definition, which is a bit older and outdated, which a lot of people still use depending on what papers they cite, or is it this newer version, the Damiot model with equity and really focusing on that, really focusing on ethics and, shared decision-making power. And I think that's really kind of profound, because I think too, you have a lot of, miscommunication happening in these discussions, because again, it's like, which co-production are you talking about at this point? And that's kind of where I'm really interested to see kind of the latter kind of go forward as the new definition, because I think it'd be, to me, that's really exciting. That's the research I want to do, some of it biased, I guess, but that's kind of where I'm looking at it, and a bit kind of looking at the current fields and the current discussions and discourse happening. And so some concluding thoughts. This is a critical analysis of NNA, but I do not consider myself separate from NNA or the Arctic research community. Is really self-criticism. My motivations understand how I would do better in doing research, doing co-production of knowledge, and then just sharing that, I think is really important. Like, I don't want to make mistakes. I know I am. It's a learning process. And kind of my goal is not to replace the letters to NSF. I think if you haven't read them, they're really important. I think for me, it was just analysis, providing the broader context, connecting it to the broader literature that's out there. And then I have these list of questions I have for myself when I'm working with people to ask myself, which is, does this project support Indigenous sovereignty and work towards creating positive changes with community partners? Do Indigenous partners have self-determination within the project? Are we following free, prior, informed consent? Does the project align with my values? Does the project align with the Indigenous community partners' values? What are my motivations, positionality, and purpose for wanting to do this project? And I just kind of want to share that because, again, that's just how I approach it after reading a lot of literature on how to do research with Indigenous people and co-production knowledge. And so that's it for my presentation. I'm hoping there'll be some great discussion questions. I cited a lot of papers. A lot of papers went into working this, and so I couldn't exactly share them all, but here are my top 5 if people want to take a screenshot.
Thank you, Margaret. This is Kazulana again. Thank you for being authentic. Thank you for speaking honestly. Thank you for putting into words our experiences and our priorities. And I do see that there are still research projects today that are colonial acts. The historical coming together of groups of people has formed who we are, has deformed who we are, has shaped our futures, has defined who has power, who doesn't have power, whose voices matter, whose voices don't matter, which is why your work is so important today. Benefit to community and prevention of harm are 2 of our most important Indigenous principles of life. And the work that you are doing is attempting to ensure that. I strongly agree with you that systemic change is needed related to research processes, because Indigenous knowledge is academic, it is scientific. Our ways are holistic and they're focused on well-being. And when this is acted on relating to research will be beneficial. So do you see the University of Alaska or UAF, UAA, UAS making a difference with research processes, or are there other universities making a difference through their IRB process or other processes?
I haven't done anything like formal, like really looking at other universities. I definitely think UAF is leading the way. IRB is very advanced, especially was really pushed to be advanced with NNA, because obviously UAF has a lot of NNA projects and researchers on projects, that there was a lot of discussion of what's the difference between when you're talking about human subject research and then you're also talking about partners, like what does that look like? And I've had a lot of great conversations with the UAF's IRB on that. I definitely do think there's probably a lot more dialogue at UAF around these issues because we have the representation to do it. I think like the Shine the Light series is an example of that. we're bringing up issues, we're pushing it forward. I think UAF still has a long way to go. That's why I'm also like sometimes hesitant because I'm in doing co-production knowledge and working with communities because I don't, inherently when I approach it is a bit extractive. Like doing my PhD, there was a lot of discussions of like, I wish I could do more co-production knowledge, but at some point too, like if I do co-production knowledge, I'm not proving that I'm a researcher and therefore I won't necessarily get to graduate. And so there's a lot of like really upper level conversations of what people find fair in the process.
Yes, I think if every researcher or research project asked themselves those same 5 questions that you had just before this slide, we'd be in a better place. Jeff Curry had a comment and then a question. Jeff wrote, the quote traditional unquote funding model makes CPK at the planning stage problematic. And then later down the line, he writes, his impression in his limited research support experience is that many NNA proposals were initially, quote, checking the box, unquote, but he feels like that is evolving towards CPK or some definition of CPK. At least he thinks folks are trying.
I agree. I think there's been a lot, participating in the broader NNA community. I think it's a lot of encouraging. It's also a lot of frustration and having to really explain things. Because again, like there's only been a few transformative, and I also have a lot of transformative allies also bringing forward topics and pushing it forward as well. I think it is just it's a slowly growing community. Not everyone's on board, but I think it's pretty exciting to be part of a growing community.
Definitely. And then Chris, I can't pronounce the last name, has a question. Do you see that transdisciplinary approaches could help to bring together research that is usually done in a, quote, post-positivistic, unquote, paradigm to contribute to liberation / self-determination?
That was a lot of a question. I was looking for it. I think there are there's a lot of great papers more from that paradigm. These are authors, which some of them are in this last slide. Elizabeth Figgis, who I saw on earlier, self-described transformative. And then she has a really great example of co-production knowledge in Cake. The Chambers paper really talks about power and the backgrounds. I think that really helps talk about like, what is the purpose of your research and why are you doing it? And then the Turnout paper, Power and Politics, a co-production of knowledge, all really great papers, all talk about really great concepts. And so I do think so. I think that answers your question.
And there are many, many messages of thanks. There are many messages, many compliments, accolades. And there's some sharing in the chat also. So Margaret, thank you very much for this incredible presentation, and thank you very much for the work that you are doing for and on behalf of Indigenous individuals and communities across the state, actually across the nation and probably across the world. Very necessary. These similar activities are happening around the globe. So thank you very much for what you've given us today. And for the participants, thank you very much for joining us. If you're interested, the upcoming Shine a Light presentations are listed at nwc.uaf.edu or on Facebook. So we will now be closing this webinar. Thank you very much.